comments. Thanks. It's great to be back in DC. I started my career here at Resources for the Future many years ago, more than I like to think, and I've always had a real fondness for Washington. So I appreciate the opportunity to come back and talk about some of the research that we've been doing, John Antle and myself, for a number of years, and to see the relevance still of some of that research and how much further we have to go. So I was asked today to the title I was kind of given and agreed to was adopting public policies and priorities to basically encourage climate-smart agricultural practices. As I indicated on there, John Antle is also listed as a collaborator. John and I have collaborated for many years. We have a lot of conversations both at work and at home about these types of challenges, and hopefully we're making some progress on them. So John says to say hi. He's not able to be here. He is in the country, which is always a good thing, since he's not necessarily in the country that often, but he did want to just say hello. Okay, so what I want to talk about is some of the themes of my research is basically threefold. One is defining climate-smart agriculture, some of the early foundations, and then what's different about this concept and this notion of safe spaces, which I think is really a useful way to think about it. And then go into what I was assigned to do, which is basically policies and some of the CSA goals. How close are they? How does one support the other? We're looking at some of the policies that we have. And then taking the liberty, as we always do when we're at the podium, to talk about what really turns us on, which is kind of some of the challenges associated with doing impact assessment, which relates to policies because they're driven by policies, so not totally unconnected. Okay, a little bit of background, and I think it's important to do this for me, just to sort of put it back in perspective, is I heard the comment yesterday that science leads to better policy, and this has really been a consistent message for 50 years of integrated research, and I put in the 50 years, putting it back to when some of the research that I was looking at as a graduate student, which was then 20 years old anyway, consistent with some of the research that was going on. And I think one of the other comments that's really has really hit home for me is that everybody talks about, oh, we're going to integrate these things. You know, you always see these flow charts. If you're ever on a review panel, you've got this flow chart where the economics is talking to the biophysical. And, you know, the details are really important. How is that going to happen? How do we really integrate across these sciences? It's very difficult to do. We heard a lot of it yesterday. There's a lot of details. It's difficult to do. It's also perhaps the most challenging things and the most exciting things we can do. So while the details are extremely important, and I'll pick up on this later, it's also really, really exciting work to do, and it keeps us on our toes. Okay, so borrowing from a few others, I wanted to just put this up there, kind of acknowledging some of the people that I knew at RFF who were doing some of this stuff really early on. And probably I think many people in the Washington community are really familiar with the work of Alan Kinesis and people at RFF who did a lot of the water resource modeling, basin modeling, those kinds of things. When I went to RFF, Alan was there, and he was pretty influential in the conversations that we would have about economics and doing this sort of integrated assessment. And he had a couple comments that I always remembered. And the first one is this notion of unbalanced policy. Anybody know what unbalanced? Okay, here's my teaching. Anybody know what unbalanced policy is? Yeah, unbalanced policy is where we put a policy in one thing, and we might deal with water or air pollution, and we cause problems in another venue. And so I think this notion of being very cognizant of unbalanced policies, I thought of it when we were talking about some of the things with the climate smart agriculture. It's multidimensional. How do we deal with and make sure that we don't have unbalanced policies? The other thing that Alan was very, a founder of is this materials balance approach. Basically looking at what do we do with the waste? How do we use that waste? I think some of those concepts are really still very much part of the climate smart agriculture. The other point that many people, not just Alan, pointed out is that we're getting really good. And we were getting really good, and we're getting really even better at efficiency. You know, we can tell you how to be most efficient in an aggregate sense with what we do. But it's not enough. And I think with climate smart agriculture and what we're doing now, the notions of other indicators that we're concerned with, poverty, vulnerability, these kinds of things, also have to be taken into account. And so when we look at our economic models, when we look at our impact assessment models, we need to be concerned with efficiency, but we also need to be concerned with poverty, vulnerability. And so those come into all the heterogeneity and the distribution of things. And how do we get models that capture that? The fourth thing is just that production happens in context. Okay? And what do we mean by that? Well, we mean that production happens on the ground. It's in the context of what the situation is there. Oftentimes in aggregate models, they leave out the context. They ignore the heterogeneity. And so they have different purposes. Some of those models are extremely useful for looking at aggregate impacts, on average, what's happening, but it ignores it. And so what we've been trying to do is to bring that context back in. And then finally, the other point that I thought about when I was listening yesterday is this notion of natural capital. And this is what I think economists can really bring to the table with respect to a lot of the modeling that needs to be done for long-term impacts. We've got to value the disinvestments that I see that are occurring in natural capital. Natural capital is one of the types of capital. As an economist, I think of capital and as a major input into welfare and production. We have human capital, we have physical capital, we have labor. We value those things very well. What we don't value well is natural capital. And in agriculture and in many of these systems that we're looking at, natural capital is key. If we deteriorate that natural capital, we disinvest in it, the irreversibilities that will occur are extremely costly to replace. And so back to this notion of valuing natural capital, which is the stock, ecosystem services are the flows. And so I think those concepts are really, really useful. Okay, so a little bit of what is climate smart agriculture. I had to go back and look at a few of these definitions. I think we've talked about this. It was initially proposed by FAO around 2010. It has 3 pillars. The first one is sustaining, increasing agricultural productivity and income. Secondly is this adapting and building resilience to climate change. And the third is reducing and/or dealing with removing greenhouse gas emissions. So we've got these kind of 3 pillars that the climate smart agriculture is built around. It's needed, and you guys know this probably better than I do. You've been working in this area, especially the people that I heard from yesterday. Why is it needed? Well, agricultural production will have to increase by 60% to satisfy expected demands for food and feed. It's also leading to climate change can lead to reductions in production and lower incomes, etc. And then in 2005, agriculture and livestock directly accounted for a major share, 13.5% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So that's the context within which we're looking at it. So what is the climate smart agriculture approach? It basically promotes coordinated actions toward climate resilient pathways through these 4 main kind of areas. And I've gotten this from a paper that recently came out in Climate Smart Agriculture for food security by Leslie Lipper, who is at FAO. And so she highlights these 4 main action areas, she and a number of other co-authors. And the first one I bolded it because it really relates to what we do in economics and what we do with modeling. And the first one, she says, is building evidence. And so in parentheses I have, this is basically identifying a set of viable options and developing what I call these tools to assess different technologies. So we've got to build the evidence for this type of approach and what we're going to do. And to build those tools that can be used at different scales by local landowners, managers, as well as by more policy-oriented communities. The other 4 main action areas I won't talk a lot about, but they're part of the CSA approach, basically local institutions, effectiveness, fostering coherence, and linking ag and agricultural financing. So it is an approach. She claims it's not a new concept, and I agree. But what the approach wants to do is kind of multi-pronged. It wants to reduce the vulnerabilities, increase the adaptive capacity, and identify technically feasible and economically viable options. And the two have to go hand in hand. And that's just a reference to the paper. The history of CSA, 2009, the term climate smart agriculture started. Carrying on, there's been a few conferences, 2010, 2012, 2013, these global conferences that have been held throughout the world. 2014, there was a climate summit in New York. And then there's been basically 2 climate smart agricultural global science conferences just targeting, and with the label climate smart, one in Wagenhagen and one in Davis, California. And now there's going to be a 3rd one this March in Montpellier. So kind of getting some prominence there. Like we said, it's not new. It's building on the past. So if we look at climate smart agriculture, which focuses on food security, agricultural production improvement, it's really part and parcel or encapsulates a green economy movement that we've had, which is basically carbon emissions reduction, resource use efficiency, and enhancement. And then it's also, you can think of it also being embedded in sustainable development. So it's kind of an overview of where we're going with this climate smart agricultural concept and approach. So in thinking about this, then my next thing was to think about, well, how do we think about what we can do and how policies can enhance this overall climate smart agriculture. And in doing that, I'm going to borrow from a figure that appeared in Agriculture and Food Security, a paper that was in Agriculture and Food Security, written by John Beddington and Molly John, and it basically is the role for scientists in tackling food security and climate change. And they define this safe operating space. And I think it's a pretty useful concept. It's not an economic concept per se. This graph isn't really what I'm used to as an economist, but I think it's a very useful graph. And what they do is they define this safe operating space as being a space that is defined or has boundaries according to like 3 relationships. And the first one is the climate change. It's defined by, well, first of all, the global food needs. So we need to make sure that we are meeting those global food needs. And we need to make sure that we can produce the food that we need. So that's the maximum food production. And then what's happening with climate change due to the food systems. These kind of loosely correspond to those 3 pillars that we had. And using that kind of safe space, we can start to analyze what happens under alternative policies. So if we're currently operating outside this safe operating space, how do we get inside of it? And that's basically, I think, one of the at least for me, one of the messages that's coming through with the climate smart agriculture. So the 2 dots up there is illustrative. If we currently are now at the lower green dot, which means that we have so much climate change occurring and we are at that point on the food axis, you can see that this is less than what we need to meet global food needs. So that's why we're seeing some of the food needs around the world. Okay, so, and if we project out to where we think we might be in 2050, and supposing it's that other green dot, then we're still in a situation where we're not meeting the food security needs. So how do we move into that safe space? Okay, so we can do 2 things. One is we can actually try to move one of those dots up into the safe space, or we can institute and think of policies that will make that safe space or that sweet spot bigger. Okay, so that's kind of how I like to think about these policies. It's a little crude, it's not perfect, but it's a good way to think about what can we do? What are some of the things that we can do to enlarge that safe space and to move us into there? So for example, let's look at how to reduce global food needs. That's that bottom global food need graph. We can eliminate waste in the food chain. We can increase the equity and access to food, or we can shift to more vegetable-rich diets. And so if that happens, we might see the relationship, or think of that relationship as moving down and increasing the safe space, or this space where we can have a climate smart, meet some of the goals of climate smart agriculture. What about maximum food production? We can invest in agricultural research and development. We heard a lot about that yesterday, to improve yields. We can adapt crops to future climate change through improved genetics. We heard about that, as well as matching crops, better matching crops to the environment. So we might be able to shift out that relationship too. Okay? And then finally, how to mitigate climate change from agriculture. We can intensify production on existing agricultural lands. It's a sustainable intensification. We can decrease the on-site greenhouse gas emissions or reduce deforestation. So once again, in this case, we're shifting the other curve back. All of these have the potential to be increasing the safe space within which climate smart agriculture can operate. Okay, so is this very useful for guiding policy? Well, it's useful in the aggregate. And it's useful in the aggregate because if we're looking at a global concept, this idea of global food needs, for example, that upward sloping graph that I had there, really is a global concept. If we're using this safe space to really look at regional, then, it's got to be modified. Because if we're using the safe space in a regional sense with trade and with some of the other opportunities that we have for food production, we don't need to produce all of our food production in the region that we're talking about. But I think it is a useful concept to be thinking about. Okay, going on, so what is the U.S. doing to enhance CSA in the United States and basically around the world? And I want to just highlight the first one, which is the climate hubs. I've had some experience with those. And can I just make this a little bigger? I'm looking at like 2 or 3 different screens, and so can we just maximize that and not show this one?
I don't know.
Okay, that's fine. I can just put my glasses on. So the climate hubs have been established by USDA to basically help deliver information to farmers, ranchers, and landowners to help them adapt to climate change and weather variability. And this actually picks up on, I don't know if any of you had read, there was a GAO report that came out, maybe about a month ago, pretty critical of USDA for what they say is not giving the information to the people that are making the on-the-ground decisions to be better able to make climate-smart types of decisions. And so here I think one of the efforts that we've been doing is to really try to get that information in a form that is usable to landowners, to farmers and ranchers, and I'll talk about that a little bit at the end. And then there's a couple other efforts there, the Global Research Alliance, Feed the Future, etc. So the question I ask at the end is, what does all this add up to? We've got a lot of efforts going on, and I think a lot of really good thinking and investments are being made. And so if climate smart agriculture can start bringing all those together, that's a huge benefit of doing that. There's also the Global Alliance for Climate Smart Agriculture. I think we've heard about this. It was launched just in September of this year, and it is a coalition of 14 countries and many organizations. And it includes, like I said, a real diversity with respect to those organizations. Member countries include the United States as well as these that are shown up there. And I just want to point out the key characteristics for me of the Global Alliance when I looked at this CSA, the action plan, is that it cites voluntary adoption and implementation of regional climate and ag policies. And that always makes me a little nervous because, we know that voluntary anything in these policy things is basically not going to be as effective at all as mandatory. So it does have this characteristic of voluntary adoption, and people in the audience may be able to be more positive in terms of what that will get us. It also is the development of these enabling environments that encourage adopting CSA. So kind of making the climate for adoption better, and I think that's a really good thing to do. Engaging many people, businesses, foundations, etc., and then integrating the integration of the CSA approach into ongoing rural development programs. So I don't know a lot about those different aspects of where CSA is going, but I did want to highlight just the adoption and the voluntary adoption. Okay, so moving on to government policies and climate smart agriculture. So kind of three areas that I'll just briefly touch on and then conclude my presentation is once again kind of looking a little bit more critically at the 2014 Farm Bill and seeing how consistent that is to some of the things we want to do with climate smart agriculture. There's certain things that it does incentivize and certain things that it probably is not incentivizing. And then what are the types of policy tools available to influence and promote a more climate smart ag, and then what do we need to know? What do we need to know, and what do we know? two really different things to do impact assessment or climate smart agriculture. So stuff we know out there, the stuff that we need to yet get to know, and that's where we need to be making some investments. Okay, so the Farm Bill 2014, it's a primary ag policy tool. Of the 12 titles in the Farm Bill, basically, I circled 3 of them, the commodity, the conservation, and the crop insurance, which probably have the greatest potential to significantly affect CSA, both in a positive and a negative direction. Many of them provide a safety net and increasing resilience. And so I've circled those 3. We can talk briefly about them. People in the audience may know more about the Farm Bill than I do, but these are the ones that I was thinking would be useful. And then I also circled the one on research. And the research one, I think is probably critical. We've all talked about how we need more research to be looking at some of these issues. And the research one is really, in the 2014 Farm Bill, very not funded very well. It's been cut back. So if we look at the funding for these 3 titles and then the 4th title, it doesn't add up to a whole lot of funding. Most of the funding in the Farm Bill, of course, is for the SNAP program. But we can look at, in turn, each of these bills, these sections. So conservation compliance, I sort of gave that a positive. They have little scorecards there. Conservation compliance basically links conservation requirements to crop insurance premium subsidies, to commodity support programs and all the conservation programs. So this is moving us more toward what I think is in line with the climate smart agriculture. Farms that have highly erodible land or wetlands must follow a conservation program to be eligible to receive government payments. Non-compliance may affect the loans, the disaster assistance payments, conservation program benefits, and federal crop insurance subsidies. So this is moving us in the right direction. Conservation, the shift toward this working lands conservation, which is the purple area on this graph, recognizes the multiple benefits of agriculture. It's for food, healthy soils, clean water, clean air, wildlife habitat, renewable energy, and other kind of conservation benefits. So I think more funding going into the working lands conservation program component is a good thing. It also includes EQIP, which provides financial assistance to plan and to implement conservation practices that improve these natural capital. Okay, so if we can look at this, and also the shift toward this working lands conservation may also hopefully tend to both shift out the dotted line as well as shift back the line that is the greenhouse gas emissions from carbon or from agricultural practices. Okay, what about crop insurance? Crop insurance gets a plus and a minus. Okay, the crop insurance, basically it's a risk management tool which helps stabilize farm income by smoothing out the boom and the bust cycles. And that theoretically stabilizes food production over time. So we're getting into some kind of food security stabilization. It's changed to, in some cases, a whole farm revenue protection, which provides protection for all the commodities on a farm under one insurance policy. And as a result, we could probably argue that it's encouraging more diversity. And we heard that yesterday, that's a good thing. The crop insurance program, coupled with price signals, has encouraged, on the negative side, growth in sort of really some of the hazard-prone areas. And it increases, the increases in extreme weather events from climate change may be further increasing such losses in coming decades. So there is some concerns with the crop insurance. Oops, did I think I need to, just wait a minute, I went the wrong way. Okay, so it tends to encourage crop production in these hazard-prone areas and basically discourage some of the CSA innovations that we've been talking about. So once again, we can think of this perhaps as shifting the line that is looking at greenhouse gas mitigations back in and making that safe space smaller. Okay, there's a few commodity programs that are still included in the Farm Bill for wheat, oats, barley, etc. And they used to be direct payments. They've been replaced with a couple of these safety net programs, and the producers can choose between a price-only protection or a revenue protection. So once again, these have pluses and minuses to them with respect to the criteria of climate smart agriculture. Farmers receive payments for covered commodities. National average price is below its target price. And then the other ARC program is basically another option there where it's based on whether the producer chooses an individual guarantee option. These things get very complicated. I think the bottom line for me is these programs provide a safety net for producers, which may increase their income and may make them more resilient, but it doesn't necessarily encourage adaptation. So we've got a plus and minus going on. And that's just an example of the curves that I think might be shifting if I were to try to relate this to Molly John's safe space diagram. Okay, so designing policies, a few fundamentals. Incentives matter. You knew as an economist I was going to come up here and say that. It's really important. Incentives are in forms of prices, taxes, subsidies, markets, quantities, best practices. Also, if we're looking at adaptation, we need to understand what are the trade-offs that existing farmers and growers are facing, and what's the opportunity cost of switching from what they're currently doing to what we would like to have them do. As an economist, I tend to think if they're currently not doing what I would want them to do from a more societal perspective, there's a reason. It isn't that they're just not. Well, a couple reasons. One is they may not be aware of it, which could be an information problem. But more than likely, it's more profitable for them to do what they're doing. And so if what they're doing is not in society's interest and in all of our interests collectively, then we need to make what they're doing currently be less attractive to them. You know, a simple thing. If you have kids and they're behaving badly, you can either tell them don't do it, or you can make what they're doing be less attractive, right, to them. So kind of the same philosophy here. But we need to understand what the opportunity cost is of moving them from one situation to one analysis to the other. And that's what economists have done. It's what John and I have done for many years with soil carbon when we were in Montana. The other thing is that we need to build evidence. This relates back to CSA, and this is where I think a lot of our efforts are going, building evidence in terms of what can be done and what it's going to cost. So, and then my third point on the fundamentals is that we really need to understand what is the question that we're asking, and how do we structure the counterfactual and then set up the integration. Okay, so this is really, I think it's a really important component. So the core questions that we need to be asking with impact assessment and as we look at designing policies is, what question do we want answered when we do these impact assessments? And typically the type of question that we want answered is, what is the economic potential, at least as an economist, for adoption of alternative systems? And what are their economic, environmental, and social impacts? For me, that captures what we want to do with impact assessment. And so we can think of three questions, or framing the question in three different ways. And the first is, what is the climate sensitivity of the current system that we're in? So 2014, if we were to take the system that we have now and bam it with a different climate, what's the sensitivity of that system? The second question is a slightly different question. The second question is, what are the future impacts without any adaptation? So if we take 2015 and we move it out to 2050, what's the impacts there? How is that different? And that's different than taking the current system. Why is it different? It's different because there's a lot of things that are going to change between 2014 and 2050. Isn't just climate. Productivity, policy, these kinds of things are going to change. And they're going to impact where we end up. I'll show you a graph in a minute. And then the third question we want to ask, or we might want to frame, is how useful are the potential adaptations that we might undertake in the future? Because we need to know a little bit. We need to have some priors on that if we're going to start investing in those. John and I have written these up in a little bit more detail, and I'll just pass over that. But basically, the same sorts of questions. So if we look at how does this, graphically, how do I think about these questions and why and how are they different? If we look at, first of all, just the symbols and outputs that I'll use on the next graph, if we think of two systems, we can have more than one, we'll think of two systems, System 1 and System 2. So the first question really looks at the current production, or the production system in the current period with the current climate, and compare that to the production system in the current period with the future climate. So we're basically not doing any adjustments. And then the outputs we want to look at are going to be the same. Changes in mean farm income, per capita income, poverty levels. These are sort of the vulnerability, as well as looking at the number of potential losers and winners. Question number 2, we'll use the circles. So it's the production system in the future period with the current climate, and the production in the future period with the future climate. And for those, we're going to need to employ what we've been using, which are these projections of productivity and price trends with no climate change and with what we call these representative agricultural pathways, and then production trends with climate change, also with these representative agricultural pathways. What's going to happen out there besides climate? And then the third question is, once we're out at that future period, how important is adaptation in terms of offsetting or enhancing some of those impacts? So graphically, what does this look like? If we simply look at the one with the negative impacts, remember to have this. So this graph over here. The first question is take the current period, and we've got climate change happening. So we'll just take the current estimates, and that red line is basically the impact that we're going to be measuring due to a change in climate. And that climate is a 2050 climate, but it's on today's systems. I think that was a little bit of what Rob Mendelsohn was doing when he was using the systems that he has and just projecting what's going to happen under climate change, but I'm not 100% sure. It's what I've done. You know, we do this a lot. We do this kind of assessment. There's other questions. Question 2 basically takes us from the current period to the future period, so the dotted line, and then perturbs it with climate. So we go from the circle dot, the open circle, to the blue dot. And the impacts that we would measure under that scenario would be given by Q2 in a negative case. So there's differences. Q1, Q2, what's the relative size of those? And then the third question is, we're still out there in the future, and we want to know how much of a benefit is investments in adaptation. And in the case of a negative situation, maybe that will move us from the solid blue dot up to the green. And so we'd be looking at that kind of an impact, right? If the reverse is true, as it is in parts of the Pacific Northwest, where I've been dealing with some of the wheat system, I'll be finished in a couple minutes. It's a positive thing. So as we go out, we can measure Q1 just being the difference in the distance of the triangles. Question Q2 takes us out to the future through some scenario development and looks at what is climate change going to do. And in this case, it's going to be beneficial in terms of yields or values, however you want to do that. And then further adaptations may even be more beneficial. So this gives us just a way to think about the policies and how we're going to go and measure those impacts. So what's a model structure that we like to use with these? Well, John and I have been using for a number of years what we call these combined process-based models with empirical economic models. And so what we're doing, and this is appropriate, I think it's appropriate when the goal of what we want to do is to project the impacts outside the range of the observed behavior, where physical or biological nonlinearities and thresholds are likely to exist. This has always been a challenge for us as we go out 50 years, 100 years. How do we do those? How do we get outside of the sample over which we're using that data? And I don't believe that we can do that just using reduced form economic models. We need to combine them with process-based models. What's also important, when the effects of the spatial and the temporal heterogeneity and the biophysical conditions are important and cannot be incorporated into empirical models because we don't have data that really captures all of that variation. So when that's the case, we also need to rely on what we consider to be these process-based models with econometric models. And then they're also useful to assess the value of as yet unobservable technological adaptations. You know, if we're going to be looking at these adaptations, we've got to use a process-based model to somehow get some information on those. Now, this isn't a panacea. There's problems with process-based models. Okay? How do we validate them? They're based on, you know, if they're projecting the future, we need to have some way of validating them and using those. We need to have some way of gathering that information and putting it into a process-based model. Not easy tasks. can I go for 5 more minutes? Is that okay? Okay, great, thanks. So we've come up with a few tools, and I think I won't spend a lot of time on these necessarily, but I did want to just talk about them. There's landscape level tools that look over a bigger landscape. SWOT analysis is one of those that's kind of in a process-based model. It's a soil and water assessment tool. There's the EPIC model that we talked about before, and then there's also John's TOA trade-off model, which is part of the AgMIP. We have to marry that or connect that with farm level tools. And farm level tools is where we've been spending a lot of our more recent action. And these are tools that are designed to really help growers or landowners make better investment and production decisions. My mantra is that as much as we like to think we're God, we don't really control the environment. What we control is, or influence, is people's behavior. And people's behavior impacts the environment. So if we're not getting good information to people to make smart decisions on the ground, we're not going to get the results that we think we would get from some of these larger aggregate models. And so that's where the Ag Tools program that we're developing is really important. And I'll talk just a couple seconds about that. So landscape and the farm scale tools, these are the ones, like I said, at Oregon State that we have. And how do they link together? Well, if we look at how these things kind of flow, we start out with the data. It can Ag census data, giving us the distribution of what's happening in the area that we're interested in with respect to economic variables. We use climate data, and then we use farm level management and finance input data. The climate data goes into the crop simulation models, these process-based models, and gives us a yield change distribution associated with changes in whatever the variable is that we're interested in, whether it's climate change or comparing two different systems. The Ag census data gives us the net returns distribution, and that net returns distribution in combination with the information from the biophysical models goes into the trade-off analysis, which is our landscape scale model. And then on the other side of the diagram, those yield change informations are also currently now being fed into what we consider to be Ag Tools, which is our farm simulator, combined with information on that particular operations management and input data. So the Ag Tools is a kind of like, I call it the TurboTax of this decision support tool, because what it's doing is being populated with the particulars from that particular operation, and they're using it then to compare different options that they have. So they're looking at net farm income on an individual farm basis. The TOA model is giving us on a more regional basis some of these trade-offs. Let me just skip over this. This is just basically how the trade-off analysis model, the TOA model works. And let me just go to some of the results. So what the TOA model is going to be able to give us at the end, following through with that flow diagram, is something about what's happening to yields as we go from a conventional tillage, system 1, to a different tillage, which is system 2. And so it does it by looking at how is the yields changing in response, and then we have to specify what is the climate, the RCP that we're looking at, what do we expect to be some of those increases in temperature that runs through the crop process-based model, goes into the economic model, and then we're able to come up with these variations or changes in mean winter wheat yields under climate change. So once again, looking at what's happening there, the solid part is just the mean and the 95% distribution on that. The whiskers go out and include the entire distribution. So we're looking at what's happening to mean yields, and then we're also looking at what's happening to some of these vulnerability measures, and in this region, in the Pacific Northwest, as I said, climate change is fairly beneficial. We probably wouldn't get these kinds of results in other parts of the developing country. The farm level decision tool, let me just talk about ag tools for a minute. Basically, it's a decision tool, like I said, that allows some kind of ability of the grower to translate this information on what's happening to climate to what's happening to his or her bottom line. And that's extremely important so they can evaluate options. So we did a comparison of the net returns with and without climate change using ag tools. And with this analysis, you can see that we basically compared two systems, a winter wheat fallow on this particular farm with an annual cropping without climate change and then with climate change, and calculated what the net farm income was, not just looking at variable costs. And with this calculator, the grower can determine that, yes, it would be at least these would be my net changes in net returns. These are my changes in net returns if I switched to annual cropping rotation that includes something like a canola as opposed to just staying with the original one. So this gives them a way to kind of look at it in a comparative setting. And I think this kind of information married up with the more regional analysis that John does is really useful for trying to get to why it matters and being able to give information to growers. I think that's all I have. I have a few other things on just the ag MIP, and I won't go to those because I'm running out of time. So glad to take some questions. Thanks.